Hello and welcome to tonight's Truth Proof live stream. Now, I've got to say, first of all, thank you for all the super chat that we received last week. That was absolutely brilliant. Also, I've got to say thank you to Deborah, who's come on moderating tonight. That's Deborah Singleton. And, Deborah doesn't take any prisoners, as you may have noticed earlier on in the stream chat. So thank you, Debs, for coming on tonight. And first of all, before we go any further, we're going to welcome everybody who I can see in tonight's chat. And the first one I see up there is Tim Brennan. Welcome to tonight's show, Tim. MKMD Exploration, Space Cadet Lottie, and let's have a look. Bad Gaming, Alison Buttle, Jane Louise Bowery, Joey Hayes, Ralph Winter. And I've got to welcome you all to tonight's show. Now, as you know by our title card tonight, we have a great guest on. But before we go any further, let's run our titles. Well, there we go. Without further ado, I will bring Mr. Paul Sinclair on tonight to introduce his guest.
Thank you very much, Les, and welcome everybody to tonight's live stream. And tonight, I'm thrilled to be speaking to Mr. Don Ecker, UFO writer, researcher, as well as former director and researcher of UFO magazine, and not least, the host of Dark Matters Radio, which I'm sure many in the chat will be familiar with. I mean, Don's I'll call him a bit of a legend within the subject, within the paranormal realm, for his knowledge, honest, no-nonsense approach. Don, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. It's truly a great pleasure to be here with you and Les.
Well, thank you. I've been looking forward to speaking to you for some time, and I'm just glad to have you on tonight. I know that you're a little bit under weather. I think all of us are, to be honest with you. So we will bear with you on that score. But where we're going to start, Don? Shall we start at the beginning and the early age and what got you involved within the subject of the unexplained?
Sure. Going back to the early to mid 1960s, my father was a military officer, ended up retiring doing 25 years in the United States Army, a truly no-nonsense kind of guy. And I'll never forget, in the spring of 1964, we were at our home, okay, we had just finished dinner. My father had gone into the living room, was reading the newspaper, and suddenly he called for me to come in. He said, "Come here, I want to show you something." Well, this was unusual to say the least. So I went in, and there was a newspaper story in there about a police officer in New Mexico who had a UFO encounter with a landed UFO. Today, it's known as the Sicario, New Mexico case with Patrol Officer Lonnie Zamora. And I read that, and I got to tell you, it was quite fascinating to me. Now, I had been familiar with people like author, writer, broadcaster Frank Edwards, and others, who had all written books concerned with UFOs, the paranormal. But this was something new. And I mean, here was a police officer. Now, in those days, everybody, for the most part, respected police officers as honest, upright, etc. And so I found that fascinating. Now, 2 years later, in 1966. And by the way, I live in California now, but my home state is in the state of Pennsylvania, Central Western. And this time of year, generally we have snow. I mean, we're just before the American Thanksgiving holidays, and then of course Christmas. And this was a time where the hunting season, hunting was a very, very big thing, especially in my part of the state. Well, in 1966, at the advent of deer season, I had been with several of my friends. I was in high school.
How old, Don? 17, 16?
16. I had been with 3 of my friends. We had gone deer hunting up around an area that, well, at that part of the country is very famous, called the Horseshoe Curve. It's a railroad emplacement. It was very famous when it was built. And usually a lot of deer up there. Well, we had been hunting all day long, and we were coming home in the afternoon. It must have been between 4 p.m., maybe 4:15. We're walking down off the hill, and suddenly one of my friends yelled, and I started thinking to myself, oh boy, this dummy saw a deer and he's gonna scare it off, right? I turned around and I looked, and he was staring up in the sky, and overflying us were 4 brilliant, almost arc lights in a diamond formation, and they weren't going very fast. And I'm gonna guess that maybe they were like 15,000 feet up in the air. And as they overflew us, suddenly the light in the rear shot straight up in the sky in an unbelievable burst of speed. I was shocked. I mean, I was standing there with my chin down around my knees. And as soon as that light, excuse me, took off, the other 3 lights, now in a V formation, hit a burst of speed, and they were gone in seconds. Well, when we got home, I couldn't wait to tell my parents about this. And, you know, they were, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting. And I was sure that this would be on the news. It would be in the newspaper the next day. Nothing.
Nothing.
Now, years later, when I made the conscious decision to become involved in this field on a professional level, I did an intensive, roughly 6-month historical research project on what exactly I was getting myself into. Now, for those that may not be familiar with me, prior to that, I had been a police officer and a criminal investigator. I was a detective, and I had been injured in the line of duty, which ultimately I ended up retiring, medically retiring. And in 1981, 82, I had been a lead criminal investigator on a cattle mutilation case that happened in the state of Idaho. So, you know, a lot of this stuff started to come somewhat together for me. And I discovered that at that period of time that I had that amazing sighting, 66, 67, during that time period, the entire East Coast of the United States had been swamped in UFO reports. Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, New Jersey, New York. It was unbelievable, with almost zero news coverage, which I found that fascinating. And, you know, maybe later in the show we can discuss that aspect a little more. But the bottom line was, I knew without a doubt, beyond any doubt, that there was something not only real to this, but something that very well could affect not only American national security, but worldwide national security.
So, Don, after that initial sighting as a 16-year-old hunter, what we know that you went on and done lots more things, but was there a gap until you became associated with the UFO magazine, or were there things that happened in between?
Oh, there were definitely things that happened in between. In 1969, I enlisted in the United States Army. That's a long story in itself. My father was incidentally very upset. He had retired in 68. We were in the middle of the Vietnam War. He was not happy about that. And but I felt it was my duty. My entire family, literally going back to the American Revolution, had been military people.
Yeah.
And I enlisted. I ended up going to Vietnam. I ended up being wounded over there. When I came back, the one thing that it was almost like a dirty little secret, a hobby. I enjoyed researching the weirder aspect of life. And one of my favorite authors at the time, later I got to meet him and became friends with him, was a guy by the name of John Keel.
Yeah.
Keel wrote one of the most amazing books ever, titled The Mothman Prophecies, which, incidentally, when that case was happening, I lived only about 2.5, 3 hours from where all that was going on. So I got a copy of his book, it was as soon as it was published, and I devoured it. I must have, well, over the years, I must have read it a dozen times. And later, when I became involved with the pursuit of this topic through UFO magazine, a lot of stuff that I had read about in there, I was no stranger to.
Yeah.
Because believe me, there was a lot of weird things that he uncovered.
Do you want to expand on the things that Keel uncovered in the Mothman prophecies? Because you're closer to the source than what any of us are.
The cryptozoological aspect of what Keel and others in West Virginia encountered, the Mothman creature, whatever in the world that was, had not only popped up there, but had popped up around the United States. My God, even in the city of Chicago, Illinois, okay, people had reported seeing a huge winged flying humanoid creature of some type on more than one occasion. And in my home state then, in Pennsylvania, I lived in Blair County. That was the county that we resided in. But right beside that was another county named Somerset County. And as I had mentioned, I did that intensive 6-month historical research. I discovered that cryptoid creatures had been popping up all over Somerset County. Now, what in the world could have caused that? Everything from dancing giant birds, monkeys, or what appeared to be monkeys. I mean, things that you don't expect to see in Pennsylvania farmlands.
Did the area have a history of it prior to this, or did it suddenly just impact the area?
Well, depending upon, now it so happens I'm a history wonk. I've loved history my entire life. I did research into that. And going back to the days before the colonization of that area with the Native American tribes, the indigenous Indians, they had legends about various creatures, and they were actually a very spiritual people. And they had a lot of legends about these things. Their animal spirits and communing with the animals in nature, that type of thing. So yeah, there were reports, depending upon who you believe. But you know, it's like with anything. When my dog, when you're working with mythology.
What
Yeah, go ahead.
was there a set pattern to what, you know, when people were witnessing the Mothman? Obviously, I've heard that it's a portent of doom, or people, that's what the kind of things they say. But what carnage did it leave in its trail, in its past, kind of thing? What?
Well, one very troubling aspect, and I encountered this personally as a police officer when I investigated. It ended up being 2 cattle mutilations. Both those animals were totally exsanguinated. They had no blood. That something happened to the blood. Now, when Keel, excuse me, this cold I've got.
I think
When
everybody's
Keel was investigating that case, when he went down to West Virginia, and he began talking to the people. He went around, spoke to the witnesses. There was one thing that he discovered that later he and I discussed at great length. These UFOs at the time, today we call them UAPs, these UFOs seemed inordinately interested in blood and blood products, including even women during their menstrual cycles. There was something about that that seemed to intrigue these. Now, later on, Keel and I had some real debates between us. He felt that this phenomena, the UFO phenomena, was not a nuts and bolts physical craft from another star system. He was very adamant about that. But what he did believe was that they were what he termed ultra terrestrial. What today you and I would probably determine he was talking about interdimensional. Now, even the MIB phenomena, Keel felt, were manufactured by something utilizing blood and flesh taken from mutilations. He actually believed that the MIB reports that people talked about, these seemingly robotic, odd, strange, weird creatures, were not humanoid per se, but were biological, if you will, robot or android that somebody had put together. So, I don't know how I come down on that, but
do you excuse me, do you see a link between the animal mutilation and the UFO sightings of UFOs, and the abduction phenomena?
well, I don't know about the abduction phenomena, but if you're talking about mutilations and UFO reports, yes.
Yeah.
I didn't at first. Okay, back when I was a working detective, I didn't. As a matter of fact, I never connected that until later. But in hindsight, and over the years with UFO Magazine and the reports, the people that we interfaced with, the cops that I talked to, the police, the investigators, I came to the conclusion that there was a very strong connection. Now, with the abductions was something, I must be very honest, I was very uncomfortable with. I feared And believe me, over the years, I had a lot of people come to me at UFO Magazine telling me about their abduction experience. And invariably, they ask me, what should I do? What should I do? And that bothered me because the last thing in the world I wanted to do was to tell them something and have them somehow be harmed by it. Okay. I did not want to be responsible for anybody undergoing more problems than they already had.
You could easily mess somebody's mind up by giving them wrong advice. That's the best advice, in my opinion. What you could have given is what you did.
I told them that by that time, we probably had been approached by well over 100 people at UFO Magazine. I really saw at the beginning of the 1990s how the abduction phenomenon for quite a while overtook almost the whole UFO phenomenon. All right, people like Bud Hopkins, Dave Jacobs, and other researchers. So I said, look, the best way I think you could handle this, number one, if you can, try to put it behind you. Okay, if you can live with it. If this was a one-off event, you know, try to come to terms with it. But if you can't, this is what I suggest. First off, see your family physician. Go in, talk to them. If you have any physical artifacts from this, and a lot of them did, all right, a lot of them did, then have the doctor examine that, see if there's any logical explanation you can come up with. If not, then, and I mean nothing derogatory by this, but if you're having some real mental issues, it might behoove you to go in and speak to an open-minded psychological counselor. And I'm not saying that I think that you're disturbed, but this is a disturbing thing. So it's something to consider. But whatever you do, and believe me, I was adamant about this, do not, in my opinion, do not seek out a UFO hypnotherapist, because my wife, Vicki, who was the founder of UFO Magazine and the editor-in-chief, and I at that time was the director of research, had gone to a number of abduction therapy sessions. And we had sat in there as observers. We were invited. And I'll never forget this. One day, a certain hypnotherapist had somebody under and were questioning them about their purported experience.
I know what you're going to
And
say.
she said, and what planet did these aliens come from? And believe me, now I had been familiar with hypnotherapy, with hypnotists when I was a police officer, trying to elicit details that the witness or whatever may have forgotten in the excitement of events. And that can be a useful tool.
But you don't add things to their memory, do you?
No, you never lead them on. And that was something I saw time and time again.
Do you know, it'd be a difficult thing, Don. I can see where you're going when you said, go see a family physician and get referred. From 1994 to 1998, I visited the doctors regularly with punch hole lesions that were appearing in my arms, on my back, all over. And I've got all the medical records. But I don't tell them what were happening. I just genuinely dare not say what were happening. They thought I were having some kind of physical abuse from my wife. They sat me down and said, tell us who's doing this to you. And I think it was a strange situation, because if I'd have said what I thought were happening, I think I'd have been going away in a straitjacket. Do you know? So it's a difficult one. I don't know what your views are on that, if any, Don, but if not, we can move on to the magazine.
Well, look, back in those days, and I'm talking about early to mid 1990s, I was active in a lot of cases. And I'm not bragging about this, but hardly a week went on where myself and UFO Magazine did not appear on some television network show. Okay. For example, in 1991, I broke what I thought was one of the largest UFO cases since Bentwaters, okay, on the Larry King live show. Now, Larry King was well, as you folks call them, a presenter, okay, on CNN. He had a popular 5-day-a-week interview program. And I must have been on his show over the years, maybe 6, 7 times, with some big UFO stories. So the story that I broke, and it was in November of 91, was there was still a Soviet Union before the Iron Curtain collapsed. The Phobos 1, Phobos 2 probe that was sent to Mars. Now, there's a tremendous amount about that case, okay, that many people even today are not familiar with. For example, Glavkosmos, which was the Soviets' space agency, had been working behind the scenes, hand in hand with NASA, with that particular mission. Because in the beginning, and we're talking about around 1988, when they started collaborating on this, actually 2 probes that the Russians sent to Mars, all the telemetry was coming back through American radio telescopes that were being fed back then to Russia. And when they launched those, well, the first probe, Phobos 1, disappeared about a month or so, maybe 2 months after launch. The Soviets, later the Russians, blamed that on a combination of human and computer error. However, the second probe, Phobos 2, got to Mars in January of '89, and then something extraordinary happened. Now, incidentally, Phobos 2 had on board an extremely powerful Russian laser. Now, at the time, what the idea was, or what they were talking about, was down the road around 2014, 2015, of sending a joint American-Russian team of astronauts and cosmonauts to Mars. Now, this was at the time, of course, all theoretical, but what they wanted to do when they got to Mars, providing they went, they wanted to use the, excuse me.
Okay.
Losing my voice.
Yeah, just take your time.
They wanted to use the Martian moon Phobos as a landing spot and then a stepping stone from Phobos down to the Martian landscape. The laser was to fire a series of laser bursts into Phobos so they could analyze the gases from that laser burst to figure out what Phobos was composed of. Now, are you familiar that in the late 1950s, Soviet astronomers then were theorizing that Phobos and its sister moon, Deimos, were artificial objects placed in Mars orbit. Did you know that?
I didn't know, no.
there were Soviet astronomers that believed that Phobos is actually a metallic sphere. Okay, now this is what they were saying then. Now, of course, I have no real knowledge about it, but this was something that the Russians then believed. Now, years later, here they are going to Mars. And incidentally, it was one tremendous effort to even get there to begin with. Both the Russians and the Americans started sending or trying to send probes to Mars in the early 1960s. And over 33% of those probes that were sent up failed. Something inexplicably happened to them. As a matter of fact, there was a joke going around NASA about the great galactic ghoul that was eating up these spaceships. Okay, it was a joke, but there was probably a little truth and reality in that. They were trying to figure out why are we failing so often. But when they did get there, as the probe, now incidentally, the probe Phobos 2 had taken a whole series of photographs of Mars. Okay, Mars has always been considered a geologically dead planet.
Yeah.
It's incidentally, it's got one of the greatest volcanic mounds in the entire solar system on Mars. But there's been no evidence that it's geologically active anymore. But what they discovered, hotspots across the Martian landscape, hotspots, which would seem to determine what? Either there is active geology
below,
or somebody reactivated some ancient space bases. Now, that sounds a little wild, right? But as Phobos 2 is taking a look around, suddenly it snapped a photograph of something that was mind-bogglingly crazy. It photographed an object off of the moonlit Phobos that the Russians said was 25 kilometers in length and roughly 1.5 kilometers in diameter. Now, they had already photographed a huge ellipsoid shadow reflected off of the Martian atmosphere. Okay, you can find this online.
I was going to say that, Don. Yeah, this information is available, isn't it? Yep.
Yeah. But this object that it photographed turned, according to Glav Cosmos, not me, turned toward their probe, approached it, and rammed it. Suddenly, Phobos 2, according to the Russians, was turned into a spinner and the craft was destroyed. Now, how did I find out about this? Because I wrote extensively about this case for UFO Magazine. One of my, and I'm very proud of this, one of my closest colleagues that, and quite frankly, I loved the man, was a man by the name of Zacharias Sitchin, who has written a series of books known collectively as the Earth Chronicle series. He was an ancient language linguist specializing in Sumerian. Are you familiar with Sitchin?
I am, yes. I've not read his work, but I know exactly who you mean. Yeah.
Okay. When his book, Genesis Revisited, came out, and we were on the copy list of his publisher because we reviewed all his books. I had interviewed Zachariah a number of times on my radio show. I read that book, and in that book, he was talking about this series of events with the Russians and NASA and Mars and Phobos and their craft. So I called him up, and I wanted to get the inside scoop on this. I began doing some research and got in touch with the Russians. I wanted to know exactly what their story was about this. And then in 1991, this is after the Iron Curtain fell, I had the opportunity to meet over here Dr. Marina Popovich, who was, and she was described as the former Soviet Union's version of Brigadier General Chuck Yeager. Now,
Okay.
Chuck Yeager was the first man in his rocket jet craft, the glamorous Glennis, to break the sound barrier, setting all types of aviation records. Well, so was this lady. This lady was a retired Red Air Force colonel, okay, had been a flyer. She had been married to General Pavel Popovich, and as she told me in a rather angry way, before he ran off with his secretary, she wasn't happy about that. But he had been the first guy to rendezvous with another spacecraft in orbit back circa 1961-62. So literally, this lady came from the creme de la creme of the old Soviet society, okay?
Yep.
She secured that photograph for me from Glad Cosmos. She came back to the United States and gave it to me, and we ultimately used that, which showed the Phobos moon with this object off the rear of it, before obviously their craft was rammed.
Yeah.
So it was an amazing story.
Absolutely. And I'm not just cutting you short there, but just before we move on to anything else, I just want, you mentioned that you went to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah. You may have no knowledge of this, but the military personnel in Vietnam talked about seeing a cryptid type creature during the battles.
The Rockies.
Yeah, have you any knowledge of that? Or
The
would you rather
Rockies.
carry on? Yeah?
Yeah. Do I have any firsthand experience? No.
Yeah. No.
No. But have I heard stories? Yes. My cousin, who I was very, very close to back in those days, had gone into the U.S. Marine Corps in 1966. He ended up going to Vietnam. He was there for the Tet Offensive in 1968, incidentally before my time.
Yeah.
And he had been stationed at a place that they called Marble Mountain, which is not too far from Way City. And that was something that he had actually jokingly talked about, these rock apes. Now, I thought they were actually indigenous apes that were over there, okay, at the time. But they used to attack the Marine Corps lines by throwing rocks at them. That's where, the terminology rock ape ultimately came from. Now, later, okay, and because of my work in mutilation, the mutilation phenomena later on and what have you, That was something that I encountered. And it later became clear to me that a lot of these reports appeared to be cryptozoological.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I have very little knowledge.
No, thank you, Don. I just wanted to touch on it before we kind of moved on. I mean, we'll ask Les if he's got any questions in a while. I don't know if there is, Les, is there?
Hi, guys. Yes, we've got a few questions coming on the chat tonight. Do you want to run with those questions now?
Just give us a couple of questions, and then I want to ask about the Japanese airliner encounter, because I know Don's got some knowledge about that, or I think he has.
Okay. Breaking the Clowns is asking, question for Don. Does he regret that nothing came from the veto of the Socorro information?
That nothing came from what?
The veto of the Socorro information.
I'm not sure what he means, the veto.
No, I don't know.
No, well, the Breaking the Clowns is
Perhaps he
probably
might want to explain himself a bit better.
Yeah, that's all there is in the question, Don. So I'll move on to the next question. Space Cadet Lotti is asking, is it true Don was involved with a top secret agency? And if so, can you speak more on it, please?
The top secret.
A top secret agency.
Is it true you was involved with a top secret agency?
Yes, it is.
And
yes.
The question was, can you speak about it?
I was a member of the United States Army Security Agency. We were involved in collecting intelligence from and around and beyond the North Vietnamese Army. We were, at the time, involved in armed conflict with North Vietnamese communists and the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. I was involved in special operations. Okay, we went out to get this information using a number of methods and using resources to get this information. And was I there? Yep. Did I do it? Yep. Did I have a top security clearance with a crypto access? Yep, I did. And beyond that, now, this is kind of funny. I and my wife were invited to the first World UFO Conference in Vienna, Austria, back about I forget now. Might have been 95, 96. We knew an Austrian researcher by the name of Mr. Ferry Radic. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly because it's been 25 years or so. But we went over there. My Lord, what a lovely country, what a lovely trip. Met with some of our British colleagues there who were friends of mine and Vicky's, my wife, Mr. John Spencer and his wife Ann, Mr. Phil Mantle and his then wife Sue, Jenny Randalls, had a lovely, lovely time. And we all spoke at the conference. Well, they had run a newspaper story about my talk, and they identified me as a former member of the CIA. And I don't read or speak German, okay? And somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, is this true?" And I said, "Is what true?" "Well, it says right here, you were in the CIA." And I said, "What?" No, I was never in the CIA. I was in the Army Security Agency, uniformed, military service. But no, I was never in the CIA. Well, this was before the unpleasantness with Saddam Hussein and Iraq. And my wife and I, one morning, were down in the restaurant, this beautiful hotel, having breakfast. And this very sharply dressed gentleman came up to the table and identified himself. He told me his name, which unfortunately is years past escaped me. And he said, might I join you? And, you know, well, yes, of course. Would you like a cup of coffee? And my God, did they have good coffee? Okay. Those Austrians had some killer coffee. Well, he sat down and he said, later on, I'd like to buy you dinner if you're available. And I'm thinking to myself, who is this guy? He's from Iraq. Well, you know, I didn't need a house to drop on me. But I later figured out this guy was, and I'll bet you $1,000 US, was an intelligence agent. And they had me identified as a former CIA guy.
Yeah.
And he told me, he said, well, you know, I will be coming to Los Angeles. Could we get together there? So, you know, by this time I'm getting uncomfortable. And I said, well, sure. You know, you've got my business card. Call me at the office. And I never heard from him again, because had he have called me, I would have called the FBI.
Yeah.
But, you know, this, you know, so I'm kind of wondering if your user that asked me about that, if he had been to the Vienna conference.
It's a strange one, Don, but we're definitely after something, weren't he? Just before
Yeah.
we go on, because I'd like to do this if you don't mind. Got one copy of the new book, people. So the book will be available in 7 to 8 days' time, and we're really pleased with it. I know this is about Don tonight, but I just couldn't do it without showing the book, because a lot of hard work gone into it. And yeah, the first.
By the way, Paul, congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's the 5th in 5 years, and that's gonna have a rest now for a while. But you know, I've had a lot of help as well. But thank you. Right, if there's no more questions, Les, or you want to wait till a little later, what about the Japanese airliner UFO encounter? I think it was like November 1986. Do you have any knowledge?
Yeah. This was a case actually after I became officially involved with UFO magazine, and that was in 1988. This thing was really beginning to hit the airwaves. Now, I have to admit that there's nothing I enjoy more than a glass of Beaujolais, all right, which is a red wine for those that may not be familiar with it. Well, as it turns out, this airliner was carrying a cargo hold full of Beaujolais from France. Okay, when I read that, I had to laugh. But they're overflying Alaska. Now, Alaska, and of course, we're talking about way up north. Alaska has always been a hotbed of unexplained aerial phenomena. Okay, I've known military guys that were based and stationed in Alaska. And over the years, I've heard a lot of reports about these craft, excuse me, these apparent craft being observed, and in some cases even chased by American military jets, and perhaps Canadian too, I don't know. But this craft encountered what the captain described as something absolutely stupendously large, an acorn-shaped object he described as at least the size of an American aircraft carrier. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the size of American aircraft carriers. They're pretty big. Yeah, they're pretty big.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely, well, as you can imagine, if you were the pilot or co-pilot flying this thing, and suddenly you encounter this thing in the sky, good God, what do you think? They called back to the control tower in Alaska. They were picking this object up on their radar scopes. They knew something was up there. They had no official tracks on it. There was no friend foe coding or any way to identify what this thing was. And thank God nothing happened to the jet. They continued on their way. Now, when the captain, and I can't think of his name now, well, it's not important. When he got to Japan, all right, he couldn't stop talking about this, as you might imagine. I mean, something like that, for most people, would be a once in a lifetime event. It ended up costing him down the road because his airline took him off flight status.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah. But, and this was surprising because over the years, I have encountered a lot of people both in active service on like the FAA or whatever the case may be, and later retired or have left, okay, that are willing to talk. But most of them, for whatever reason, won't. Well, the FAA man who had been there luckily copied all the documents because they had a big debriefing by federal authorities that allegedly were sent by President Ronald Reagan's science advisory, or at least they had representatives there. Yeah. Now it's an open secret that Reagan was seemingly preoccupied with questions about extraterrestrial life, visitation, etc. And on 5 occasions, Reagan, even at the United Nations, rhetorically, supposedly, asked the question, because we were in the middle of the Cold War. Things were not friendly between the Soviet Union and the United States. There was always the fear that they could escalate, and there were a number of situations and events that could have led to tragic events. But Reagan said, wouldn't it be something that if suddenly the Earth was confronted with the evil power from outer space, what would we do?
Have to join.
We'd all join up together. And news reporters even asked Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then the leader of the Soviet Union. And he said, well, yes, of course, we would all join up. Even Gorbachev said, yeah, you bet. So this was something I found extraordinarily interesting. Well, later, this FAA guy, or former, came out and described what had gone on. He thought these science guys that were sent in by the federal government were CIA, because they grabbed all the documentation, the radar tapes and everything, and this stuff disappeared. was gone. But he had kept his copies. So later he presented those. And we know for a fact that this case actually happened.
Yeah.
It actually occurred.
It's a fabulous.
Let me apologize for my voice because
I think we're all a bit under the weather, Don. I mean, I don't feel too great myself today, and I know Les doesn't. And as you alluded to before we came on, you hope you're going to get through it. This will probably be a yes or a no answer. Have you ever been given any information or told anything that's highly secretive or sensitive that you believe is the truth, but you can't talk about it?
that at the time was top secret, and no.
Right.
Later, after stuff had been declassified, I was told about something, but no, nobody ever broke their security oaths and brought me some hot topic, that nobody else knew about. No, never.
Okay. So, do you think there's any one or number of organizations sitting on the truth of what this phenomena is? Or do you think none of us really know the true origins of it?
Well, I'll tell you this, and this is my speculation, strictly mine. I do not have insider information about this, but I do believe that there are individuals that are much more cognizant of what is going on than we are. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I've been banging around this field for over 30 years. Okay. 30 years I've been involved in this. And for a very long time, I felt as time marched on that I knew less about it than when I first began.
Yeah.
Okay. Back in the beginning with me, with my participation, I was firmly in the school of nuts and bolts craft coming from another star system. Later, my thinking changed. Now, that's not to say that I discount that, but I have opened my mind up to encompass a couple of more possibilities. Now, do I know one way or the other? No. But I suspect that there are aspects of this phenomenon that are nuts and bolts from somewhere else. But I also believe, and this I do have some information on that I haven't talked about a lot, but that there is the excellent possibility of interdimensional incursions into our reality. And there's one more possibility. And this is something that, quite honestly, I am entirely freaked about. In the last several years, I have been researching pretty much quietly. I have talked about it a little bit, but not a lot, into pre-diluvial human civilizations. Okay. Now, roughly 12,000 years ago, where I'm at right now in California, half or more of the North American continent was encased in at least 2 miles deep ice. Right here at my home, and I live in a canyon right off of the Angeles National Forest, great woolly mammoths marched up and down. Saber-toothed cats, the smilodons, the ones with the big fangs, okay?
Yeah.
Dire wolves, giant ground sloths, bison, much larger than what we currently have here. and human beings running around hunting them with stone-tipped spears and arrows.
Yep.
But was that it? Or was there more? I believe because, well, people I know, researchers I've talked to, authors, that seem to suggest there were human beings here that were much more technologically advanced than stone-tipped spears and arrows. Then we go to somebody like the great philosopher Plato, who wrote in his Timaeus and was it Critias or yeah, anyway, where he talks about Atlantis, or what they called Atlantis, because suddenly something happened. I think it was an astronomical event, but something happened that caused all of that ice to dissipate, geologically speaking, in an eye blink. And all those animals I just described disappeared in an eye blink. All those then human beings, we call them the Clovis peoples, suddenly in an eye blink were gone. Now, what could have done that? Well, actually, we can't say with absolute certainty, but in the last few years, in Greenland, a crater was discovered under the ice that is over 100 miles in diameter. And it is believed that around that time period, and there's, by the way, there's much more to this story, something came through the atmosphere, hit, and fragments of it are believed to have hit in North America that caused this sudden ice melting. Now, when that happened, not only did the ice melt, but millions and millions of tons of fresh water from that ice went into the ocean. The oceans raised anywhere from 2 to perhaps as much as 400 feet higher than they were. What happened? Well, the land
Cleansed it.
was gone. Okay. Now, in the 1930s, National Geographic ran a series of articles about some Siberian hunters in what, of course, then was the Soviet Union. These hunters discovered vast junkyards of bone. Okay. What they were the remnants of herds of great woolly mammoths, a huge animal. Okay. Basically, kind of like an elephant, but with a lot of hair and big curly tusks. Well, my dad had bought, because my great uncle, which I didn't know, okay, had been a National Geographic subscriber since the turn of the 19th or the 20th century, from the beginning of the 1900s. He had them all. And my dad, after he passed, my dad bought all those magazines from his widow, the princely sum of $5. And he brought them all home. And boy, I'll tell you, as a kid, there was nothing I loved more than diving into those magazines. And I came across those stories about these hunters. And it was described as if the hand of the deity had scooped up these animals and threw them with incredible force, smashing them apart. It was theorized that the winds that would have done that were over 1,000 miles an hour, okay, that literally lifted herds of these animals up and tore them apart. We found the remnants, or the remnants were found. Now, a couple of years ago, and this is all pre-diluvial, right? This is all before the flood. I had an archaeologist on my radio show, a woman who was fascinating interview, fascinating. And she really managed to upset the mainstream academic community because she was willing to look outside the box.
Yeah.
All right. And they weren't happy about that. And she had a lot of stories about things that had happened to her, as a result of her uncharacteristically non-academic pursuits. So we're talking, and of course, one of the topics that came up was the topic of Göbekli Tepe. All right, this amazing prehistorical site that was discovered, well, back literally at the beginning. The first discoveries were in the 60s and later in the 90s, and they started digging this up, and they found this amazing, what could only be a huge prehistoric temple complex with amazing columns with carvings of animals and astronomical events and so forth. Now, academia would have you believe that at that time, we're talking about 11,600 years ago, roughly.
So this is Paleolithic times, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Were human beings living in caves.
Yes.
All
Yeah.
right.
But they can't have been. They
No.
can't have been.
So I asked my guest, I said, well, if somebody were to ask me about this, I would have to guess that the people that created this massive, unbelievable site over a very long period of time were originally refugees. And she said, you're absolutely correct. That is my belief too. They were refugees. All right, doctor, from where? From prehistorically destroyed civilizations. Destroyed how? By the flood and whatever it was that happened. So,
Amazing. Yeah.
and I mean,
amazing.
yeah, this is the kind of information and this is the kind of research that really galvanizes me. I find this, I could just bathe myself in that information.
Well, I'm hoping you might be able to bathe yourself a little bit to don in a bit of knowledge of Roswell for us, because I'm sure that you'll. I know it's been done and done and done, but tell us a little bit about it from your perspective.
Well, I knew all the premier Roswell researchers, Kevin Randall, Donald Schmidt, Stanton Friedman. These guys, well, I still know Randall and Schmidt. Stanton Friedman, unfortunately, he passed away.
It did, yeah.
But there were others. I knew Dr. Jesse Marcel, the son of Major Marcel of Roswell fame. As a matter of fact, I, excuse me, don't know if we will have time to get to it, but I was involved, quite a bit involved, in an amazing situation that happened with the Disney company in 1995. And Dr. Marcel, who incidentally was a brigadier general in the National Guard, okay, was a physician and a brigadier general officer, okay, was one of my guests. He literally handled some of the debris. So, yeah, okay. Now, in 1994, and you have to understand with UFO Magazine, we were getting and fielding calls from media, television, and what have you all the time. I had received a call from, I'm trying to think now what show it was, about a new, or at least to these guys, a new phenomenon called flying rods. Have you ever
Yes,
heard about the flying rods?
I have, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, they were coming from a researcher out of Roswell. Okay. Now I knew this guy. So the TV show asked me if I would be willing to fly down to Roswell and see this fella and take a look at his evidence and give them my thoughts on it. So I checked with my wife, and because UFO Magazine was a small operation, and whenever I would go out on the road, okay, that could put a crimp into what we were doing. We didn't have a lot of people. And she said, yeah, go ahead if you want to. So I ended up going with a friend of mine, Dwight Schultz. You may know him from the television show The A-Team. He played the crazy helicopter pilot,
All right.
and
Yeah.
okay, and Star Trek: The Next Generation. He played Lieutenant Barclay, the shy engineer. Okay, well, Dwight had a fascination with the UFO topic, and what he was most curious about concerning UFOs, other than the actual phenomenon itself, were the people that lied so much
Yeah.
about this. Okay, the posers and the hoaxsters and the liars, and there were a lot of them.
The ones who tell a story and suddenly expands over years to be something massive. You know,
Yeah,
it's not a bad angle to look at. But sorry, Don, go on.
yeah. So we flew down to Roswell and got down there, and I I looked at this fellow's stuff, and he took us out to the place where he had filmed a lot of this rod material, and I knew immediately what it was. They were flying insects. Okay, they were videotaping. Yeah, these things were zipping around, flies and moths and all kinds of stuff. And I told him that. I said, "Look, I got to tell you, I'm afraid I don't think you have anything here." And oh my heaven, did he get upset? He was really upset. So we got done with that. And in Roswell at that time, there were two UFO museums. And the one that is not there anymore was run by a fellow by the name of Mr. John Price. And he had a diorama of the Roswell crash. He had this UFO, this diorama with this crashed UFO and, desert motif around it and what have you. And we went down. I took a bunch of pictures for the magazine. And in the back room was a fellow. And John came to me. He knew me, of course. He said, Don, he said, we got a guy here that says he was stationed there when the event happened. And he's up from Texas. And I said, oh, really? Well, I'd like to meet him. And John had a reproduction of the 509th Bomb Group yearbook. They had put out a yearbook back in the day.
So it's going to
with
be
all the men stationed there, their photograph, just like your high school yearbook or something along that line. So he was looking through this reproduction for his picture, which incidentally he did find. And so we went in there. John introduced us. His name was Thomas Gonzalez. He had been stationed at Roswell. He now was living in Tomball, Texas. This 1994. All right. He was quite an elderly gentleman then. And we're sitting in there, we're talking to him. He's telling us some amazing stories. He was by, you know, he was an American, but by ancestry, he was Hispanic. His family had come up from Mexico. He still had a very strong Spanish accent. And now, by that time, I was familiar with a number of survivors from the 509th that had been there during this event. And a lot of these guys, okay, after whatever it was that happened, Paul, underwent a tremendous, profound change, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Now, I know something about PTSD after my foray into Southeast Asia. And this gentleman, Thomas Gonzalez, and his wife, incidentally, had passed several years previously. They had been together for over 50 years. After whatever happened, happened. And let me stress that I don't know what happened. All right, I wasn't there. Hell, I wasn't even born. But whatever it was that happened, okay, it affected this man deeply. And he began for years alcohol abusing. He was an abuser of alcohol, which a number of those people underwent. Okay. Well, he was dry when I met him. Okay. He had put that behind him years before. But Dwight Schultz and I were supposed to catch our plane to get out of there. So we had to leave. All right, we had to leave this man. We got out of there, went back, got our stuff at the hotel, went to the airport. And at that time, now I don't know about today, but at that time, they had a very small, like community airport, and puddle jumpers, little, aircraft would fly in and fly out to the big airports. Well, our airplane that we were supposed to fly out on, the rubber band broke. Okay. We ended up being there another night. So I got back on the phone when we knew we couldn't leave. And I called John Price and I said, is that gentleman still there? Well, no. He had gotten up and walked. It's a very surprising little antidote to this story. Back in this time period, Paul Davids, which is somebody I know. Do you know that name, Paul Davids?
No.
Paul Davids was the producer of the movie Roswell with Kyle MacLachlan.
Okay.
You're familiar with that movie, right?
Yeah.
Okay. They were beginning, and it was going to be premiered, I believe it was Showtime. I think it was the Showtime network. It wasn't HBO. I'm pretty sure it was Showtime. Well, somehow Mr. Gonzalez had seen a promo for this movie, and he got it somewhat confused. He thought the actual 509th was having a reunion. Now, he wanted to be a part of the reunion. He didn't realize it was a movie. Well, he was living with a daughter who was divorced with a couple of kids. I hope I'm not talking out of school, but it's been years. She had taken over his Social Security checks.
There.
He was at the mercy, basically, of his daughter.
Yeah.
And she began bossing him around. Well, he was having none of that. Well, one day they got into a squabble. He left, and he remembered seeing this Showtime promo that he thought was an ad for an actual 509th reunion.
And he went off.
He went off, got himself a bus ticket, and went up to Roswell. Now, he had also a couple of sons that lived down there. They were on very good terms with their dad. Now, I don't want to get too wrapped up in this, but the bottom line was I wanted to get back in touch with him. So I called Price, and he didn't know anything about it, about what happened to the man. And then the Roswell Police Department got contacted by, it might have been either the Sons or the Tomball, Texas Police Department, trying to track down this gentleman. Well, I had to end up putting on my detective hat to track down an address for this guy. Well, when I did, I called up one of the sons, told him who I was, and my wife and Dwight and myself flew down to Texas, to meet this guy. Well, part of the attraction was Mr. Gonzalez had told me emphatically that he had picked up a piece of the wreckage debris from the crashed flying saucer. Okay, that's what he called it, a flying saucer. Huh? Yeah. And he also told me there was one living entity when he was there with the military, and a number of dead entities. And the one living entity, he didn't call them alien or ET he called them the moon men. The moon men. That was his term for them. That this entity had communicated with him through using telepathy. This is what he told me. Okay. Yeah. Now, do I know that for a fact? No. But this is what the man had to say. So we went down, and I took my video camera, and I interviewed him for a couple hours. All right. And he was emphatic about this piece of debris. Well, I asked, and he also said, he told me, I used to keep it on my television set. It was like a rock. It was on my TV. And as a matter of fact, that's what the kids called this thing, the rock, Dad's rock, Daddy's rock, that he got at Roswell. Well, he showed me a photograph, and it was taken at Christmas time. The Christmas tree was off to the side. Here was his television set, and this thing sitting on the top of it. I don't know what it was, but it was there. So I asked him, I said, where is this? Can I see it? And I told him how important, if this is real, you know, this is an actual piece of debris from what might be a spaceship from another solar system.
Yeah.
Well, he said, I'm not sure. It could be in my stuff. Now, when his wife died, his home ended up being red tagged. Do you know what that means?
No,
It
enlighten me,
was
please.
falling down. The home was
Okay, yeah.
falling down. Okay. Unfit for human occupation. So a lot of his stuff he packed up. It was in storage. All right. But the house was still there. So we asked him, Mr. Gonzalez, could we go down and go through your house, search it? And he gave us permission. So Dwight, my wife Vicky, and I ended up going down and spent a whole day crawling through this decrepit, falling down house. And we came out of there with flea bites and oh God, it was
But you never
it was a
found it.
mess. No,
You
no. But he thought it might be in one of his military trunks. Now, there was only one problem. His daughter that he was squabbling with, that was angry with him for taking off, and her stipend coming from the old man was no longer coming. She had the keys to get into the storage area.
Yeah.
I had one of the sons, I asked one of the sons if he would call his sister up to see if she would allow us to look through his stuff, his military trunk. She refused to give, the keys to anybody, and she hung up.
So potentially, Don, if this guy's telling the truth, there's a piece of wreckage out there somewhere still, isn't there? You know, I know it's all speculation, and I don't expect you to jump off the fence with this. But what's your gut feeling? Was he telling the truth, or weren't he?
I think, I think he was telling the truth. And believe me, I've looked at that case for years. All right. On the 50th anniversary of the Roswell event, the U.S. Air Force came out with their infamous report, Roswell, case closed. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
On that anniversary, I had been contacted by a number of news organizations, including the NBC Nightly News, and I was interviewed for a number of these. One of the shows I was interviewed for was on MSNBC. And this was just about the time the Air Force was holding their press conference. Now, by that time, the Air Force had not yet released the report to anybody. So they could virtually say anything, and nobody could refute them because they didn't have the report. Now, later, when we got our copy, which I still have, I started going through this thing. Now, remember, I was a cop. I was used to keeping a pretty close eye on stuff. I came across one of the supposed explanations for what happened at Roswell, courtesy of the U.S. Air Force. They had a photograph of a disc-shaped object sitting off in the dirt. And I remember the Air Force colonel, when he was giving his package speech, pointing to that and said, you know, if I was out driving along and, oh, I saw something like that sitting in the desert, I'd sure want to stop and take a look and maybe even poke at it. But spaceship, well, what it was a space probe from 1972. Okay, Roswell happened in 1947.
Yeah.
Okay, now, would you please tell me, Colonel, how we went from 47 to to seeing this thing in 1972. And he did the same thing with the bodies.
The thing is, though, people en masse, they won't see that gap in between, Don. They'll just swallow it, won't they?
Well, most people, yeah, they don't know what the heck to look for. Okay, they don't know what in the world to look for.
Just one more thing. Sorry, Don, go on, fire away.
The other thing was the bodies. The Air Force tried to explain reported viewings of ET bodies by witnesses from a parachute test that took place in the mid-50s. And it's ludicrous. And when one of the reporters asked this guy, well, how do you explain that? Well, we think it was time compression, is what he said. Time compression? What in the world is time compression? It was a dog and pony show, Paul.
Yeah. Just before we leave this, and you said you interviewed this guy, what was the message that the alien gave him? Or can you not remember?
They're just coming by for a visit. That's what he claimed. You know, now, was that the real thing? Who knows?
No.
But, you know, nothing nefarious.
No.
And even if it was, would they tell some rank and file guy, you know, especially if you're laying there maybe dying? Why are you here? Oh, we just wanted to come by and say hi, you know, whatever.
Okay, right. Jumping from that, I think we'd better ask Les if he's got any questions for us, because looking at it, we've hung in there, Don, haven't we? We've managed it. Not feeling too great, but we've done it.
Yeah, that's a great account, that, Don. Thank you very much. We'll just do a little bit of housekeeping here, Paul.
Yeah.
You've already mentioned from Truth Proof there is a new book. So if you want to tell the viewers, listeners, where they can pick this book up from, please.
Oh, well, the book's available on the Truth Proof website, so it's truthproof.uk. And but please be aware, anybody that does order the book, we're another 7 days at least away from me receiving them. Orders in, so that's what I'm told. And just let me know, good or bad, what you think to it when you've read it. Thank you very much.
Yes, and just a reminder, Don, for people who haven't heard you before, where can they find you for your podcast?
Well, we're supposed to begin the new show tomorrow, but quite honestly, I don't know if I'm going to make it on the KNUX network. And I am on Facebook, and I also have a fan page on Facebook called Dark Matter, or the Don Ecker and Dark Matters Radio fan site. So I have a personal page, I have the DMR page, and anything that we're doing, you can find information up there on that.
I've got to say that I've been looking.
I hope I'm not too long-winded tonight. Sometimes I get I get a little, you know.
It's all in the detail, Don. So if people don't like it, it's too bad, innit? I mean, I'm no offense to anybody. It's good. At least we get some facts with you, and there's nothing sort of airy-fairy. You don't just throw everything out there and believe everything you're told. You actually analyze everything, and you know, you realize that most of what we're doing, myself included, it's pure speculation based on what we're observing and what we're being told.
Okay, yeah. Yes, we all need a good cough tonight by the sound of it. Right then, I'm moving on with some questions, guys, and let's have a look. Well, here's a good question, Don. What is Don's opinion on the winged humanoid reports from the O'Hara airport?
Well, you know, the best way to answer that, and it's going to sound in a roundabout way, back when I was a uniformed police officer, let's say 2 cars met together in an intersection, and there was 25 people standing around. Well, you'd get 25 different explanations of what happened. Now, I have never believed that people would come up with something so outlandish, making it from whole cloth. They saw, as a rule, something. Okay? They saw something. Now, did they see what they say they saw? Well, that's hard to say because I wasn't there. But if there are other witnesses there, let's find out what they saw. Now, depending upon how far you want to track it, when I was a cop, one of the things you would do would be do a little investigation if it were that, that astounding on the witness. Who is this person? Do they have a good reputation? Are they known for their honesty? Are they known for being a practical joker? That type of thing. But, usually you're not going to go into that kind of detail with something like this. When I have gotten those types of reports, as a rule, I would tuck them into my gray basket until such time as more information might be forthcoming. For example, like reports of the black-eyed kids. Are you familiar with those?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Now there is something that, wow, that is extraordinary. That piqued my interest several years back, and I began because I was curious and fascinated. What in the world is behind this? And one of the things that I found, wow, the wow factor, was that every report I came across where these BEKs, these black-eyed kids, would show up, they almost begged for permission to come into the house. They had to ask permission. If they didn't get permission, then they couldn't come in for whatever reason. And I often wondered what would happen if somebody did give them permission. What next? But these reports were something that showed either an otherworldly presence or almost a magical presence. Now, I'm kind of, I guess it would not be going too far to say I'm kind of a noted historian on vampiric lore. All right, vampires. I wrote a novel about vampires titled Past Sins. And when I wrote that novel, this is a story for another time, but I went into the mythology, literally going back thousands of years. And that was something that I came across from vampire mythos, where they had to be given permission to enter a domicile or whatever the case may be. So there was a lot of similarities between the BEKs and vampire mythos, and I was just fascinated by that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Les?
Yes, it's always fascinated me, the black-eyed kids. And you mentioned that, Don, you mentioned they had to be invited into the domicile, obviously to do their whatever deed they're trying to do. Now, somebody could correct me, but I think somebody did invite them in once. I did hear a story that suggests they invited them in. What happened to them? Well, I don't think anybody heard of them from there on in, so I don't know what happened to them. No, what it was, guys, I think there was somebody who invited them in, but I just can't remember the full story. If anybody knows that story, then yeah, I'd be keen to hear that as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, I'll move on with another question, and also, let's have a look. Question from Lee Roscoe.
Hi, Lee.
Well, Lee, yeah, welcome to the show. What does Don think of the Roswell incident? Now, we've covered that,
Yeah.
extensively, yeah, Lee, as you probably just heard. So I'll move on to the next one, but thank you for the question. In any case, Patricia Adams writes, Don, what do you think the knowledge is they wish to get from the mutilations? What do you think the knowledge is they wish to get from these entities doing the mutilations?
Is it?
I wish I knew, because these things have been reported going back to at least the 1950s. Now, the animal that I physically examined in the aftermath of a mutilation that happened some hours the previous evening, okay? I got there, the kill was still fairly fresh. I discovered an eyeball removed. I discovered a patch of skin and flesh down to the jawline. I discovered the rectum literally cored out. I discovered the tits of the animal removed. But this has happened thousands of times before. So the only thing that ever made sense to me, and it's still ongoing now, if they wanted to find out, for example, environmental factors, all right, environmental factors were different probably in 1975 than they are today in 2021.
Yeah.
That could be one of the reasons, okay? Depending upon how wonky you want to get, all right?
I would be with you on these things. You'll not know this, Don, but during 2017-18, I looked into a large amount of animal mutilations here on East Yorkshire coast. I mean, one guy lost up to 50 sheep. There were roe deer, there were badger, there were fox, there were harbour porpoise. It's hard to imagine a porpoise displaying a similar injury to a sheep, but it were all trauma holes straight through the jaw, eyes removed, as you've said, but with no trauma around the eye socket, as though it's just been taken out, no blood. And I think that's something that you'll have found in most of the cases you've looked at, Don. Is it the lack of blood?
Yes.
Yeah.
Almost everyone that falls under that classic mutilation nomenclature.
Yeah.
The blood is gone. What in the hell are they doing with the blood? Now, John Keel surmised that flesh that they take, that blood that they take, they were utilized or using in the manufacture of their, what do I call them? Their biology experiments, you know,
Yeah.
their MIBs or, excuse me.
It's okay.
So might he be onto something? I don't know. John tried to convince me in 1997 that Roswell was not a UFO, but a Japanese Fugo balloon. Do you know what the Fugo balloons were?
No, tell us.
Before the Second World War was ended, all right, and the Americans and the Brits and the Australians and, you know, all of we allies together were beating the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy back toward Japan. The Japanese were looking for a way to strike back, especially the United States. So some bright guy over there figured out that with giant balloons atmospheric devices and a bomb load. They could attach them to balloons. The jet stream would carry them over the United States as they lost their hydrogen or whatever they were using.
Did lower.
The balloon would come down, and at a certain point, they would release the bombs. Well, they did that. Now, the problem was, and I tried to tell Keel this, those balloons were made for the most part from rice paper, treated rice paper, granted, but rice paper. And that kind of stuff would not last 2 years in the elements, okay? Because Roswell happened, best guess, June, beginning of July 47. The war was over, for all intents and purposes, August 45. They were sending these balloons over during that year, during that period of time. And if they got over here, not all of them did. A lot of them were destroyed or whatever. They would be sitting out in the elements. These things would deteriorate.
They'd have just perished, wouldn't they? They'd have never lasted. I would agree. I want to ask you more about that, but let's try and get through some of these questions because we've got probably 5-10 minutes left. Go on, Les.
Yes, we'll move on to the next question, which is from Warren Hardcastle.
Warren.
Warren is asking, would be great if Don could give us his thoughts on aliens on the moon.
Oh. Well,
have we got all night, Don?
Here's my dirty little secret. I have been researching that for over 20 years. In 2014, I was the research producer on Aliens on the Moon, The Truth Revealed special that aired on the Sci-Fi Channel. And well, I would need a whole show, perhaps 2, to go into all the dusty little corners of that episode. But to make a long story short, I am firmly convinced that our moon has been utilized as a base for who knows how long. On the rear, the side that faces away from us, okay, that we never see unless we go up there and orbit it, there are facilities, perhaps ancient, perhaps still in use, okay, by inhabitants there. If I believe what I was told by somebody who was in a position to know, whoever is up there are not our friends, okay? What convinced me that there was something to this? Well, there are a lot of things, but I discovered from the archives at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, which has a lunar archive there, I discovered some photographs, and this is a story in itself, but one of these photographs clearly show a lunar crater with a huge, could only be industrial-sized pipe running through the crater. You can follow it along the ground. You can see where it goes under the ground to a cliff where it extends out the cliff with a very odd contraption on the end of the pipe. Now, we didn't put that up there. The Russians didn't put that up there. Who put that up there? Excellent question. Now, I was personal friends with Ingo Swann. Now, if that's a name you don't know, Ingo Swann was the man that designed the protocols for the Stargate the Stargate program, where the military employed trained remote viewers, remote viewing, okay, which I might add, they kept going for over 20 years before some wonk at the CIA allegedly shut it down. But, gentlemen, you don't have something like that go on for that long and not get something from it and then just arbitrarily shut it down. That program is still happening. Now, what does all this mean? It means that Swan, and it's an extraordinary story, was contracted to remotely view unknown coordinates to him, which ended up being, by incidentally, a very shadowy group of unknown individuals that ended up being on the far side of the moon, which, according to Swan, was clearly an operating extraterrestrial base. All right. Now, this is something that kind of like the pre-diluvial human civilizations, blows my mind. Now, with this 2014 television program that I was the research producer on, I had, and still do, some extraordinary lunar photographs that I got from NASA sources. These weren't pictures I took through my telescope. These photographs clearly show what, in my opinion, could only be artificial objects that somebody put up there on the moon. One of the guests, and I was interviewed along with being the research producer, I was interviewed for this show. And the guy that was interviewed right after me was none other than Buzz Aldrin, the second human being to ever step foot on the moon. And of course, this was on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo touchdown, Apollo 11. And the executive producer wanted to get Aldrin's take on some of my pictures. Aldrin was sitting there at a desk. They brought the photographs, one of them being the crater with the pipe through it.
Yeah.
Set them down in front of Aldrin, and this is what he did. He turned his head. He refused to look at it. The only thing that, and he refused to talk about the moon, by the way. The only damned reason he was on the program.
Yeah.
He's looking away. The only thing he did want to talk about was the Martian moon Phobos, which seemed to have some type of obelisk on it. Now, he would have talked all night about that. But here was a guy that went to the moon, was with Neil Armstrong, the only first two human beings to sit down. And guess what, guys? He didn't want to talk about the moon. Now, isn't that a little odd?
Yeah, just a bit. It is. And jumping from that one, Les?
Yes, thanks for that, Don. And the next question is and from Teresa Walker, and I think you've already answered this question, Don. And she was just asking, do you think the moon could be an artificial satellite?
Yeah.
So it's very much on the same vein of what you've just been talking about, Don.
Well, actually, no, I didn't talk about that aspect, but it is curious to note that when we first went up there, all right, with astronauts, we ended up dumping a booster rocket that was, done out of fuel, whatever, into the moon in an experiment. Even NASA stated that the moon rang like a bell for hours afterwards. Now, the only way that happens is if you've got a hollow object. Okay?
Yeah.
A hollow object. So, would I dismiss the possibility that it could be artificial? No, I wouldn't.
Okay, thank you.
And, yes, I remember when that was published, Don. I think it was in the 1970s, wasn't it, when they crashed one of the booster rockets into the moon? Yeah. And let's have a look. We've got a question from Dean Coolin.
Hi, Dean. I
Welcome
hope
to
you're
the
feeling
show,
better, mate.
Dean. Yeah.
Dean spent the weekend in Forest with us last weekend. Good to hear from you, mate.
Question for Don. In the context of the object seen KMs long near Phobos, do you think Mama, I can't pronounce it, guys. It's
Amoa,
Amoa. That's it, guys. Thank you. Thank you, Don. Struggling now. And do you think the Amoa similar and stroke, or what are your thoughts on what Amoa is and where from, etc.? Sorry for hashing that up, Dean.
No, it sounds like a bit hard going reading it, but
well, Amoa is one of the most astonishing astronomical events in my lifetime. Here's an object that clearly came from interstellar space, entered our solar system, skimmed past the Earth, the only inhabited planet that I'm aware of in our solar system, and flew back out, headed for interstellar space. Now, one of my dearest, closest friends is Dr. John Brandenburg, a noted Mars scientist. As a matter of fact, John is the fellow that basically discovered that at least 2 nuclear devices, he's convinced firmly that they were artificial, okay, not a natural nuclear meltdown like happened here on Earth roughly 3 billion years ago, but somebody detonated 2 devices. Yeah, Paul.
I'm just because I know this is going to be quite a long story, and we need to condense this because we're just about.
Oh, I'm going to.
Thank you. Great stuff.
I have a clock here. Honestly, I didn't think I'd last this long.
Well, you haven't. Thank you.
But John and I had several long discussions about Oumuamua. He is convinced and convinced me that it, in fact, was at the very least a probe sent by somebody, not around here, not in these parts, but somebody to see what in the world's going on in our neck of the woods. He's convinced. Now, he's not the only guy that's convinced. A leading astronomer at Harvard also came out with that conclusion. So is it possible that somebody has been keeping tabs on us? I think so. See how I concise that, Paul?
Fabulous. Don Ecker, thank you. Seriously, because I know you were under the weather. You've done us proud, mate. Really appreciate it. And speak to you soon. Yeah, thanks in the chat. Yep.
Okay, so there we have it. Another great show, great guest on tonight, Don Ecker. You can find his podcast, as we mentioned. His podcast, his Facebook page will be in the show notes underneath after the show is finished tonight. And it remains for me to say you've been a great audience. We've had some fantastic questions coming for Don and Paul. and we will probably, with a good following wind, catch you all next week. Have a safe week, and bye from the Truth Proof team.